The stagecoach wheel struck a rock hard enough to throw Sarah Fletcher against the wooden bench, and the music box that had been resting in her lap tumbled to the floorboards with a sound like breaking teeth. She scrambled after it before the elderly man across from her could offer help, gathering the small mahogany box against her chest as though she had lost a child instead of an object. When she lifted the lid, the brass cylinder inside sat crooked, 3 of its delicate pins bent flat, and the comb that should have plucked out her mother's favorite waltz only rattled uselessly when she turned the key. It was the autumn of 1878, and Sarah had been traveling for 11 days from Ohio to the Colorado mountain town of Silver Creek, carrying with her one trunk of clothing, $42 sewn into the hem of her petticoat, and the music box that was the last thing her mother had touched before the fever took her. She had told the driver she was coming west to keep house for an aunt who did not exist. The truth was simpler and harder. She had nowhere else in the world to go, and a man named Cyrus Bellamy back in Ohio who believed she belonged to him whether she wished it or not. The stagecoach rattled on through the foothills as the sun dropped low and orange behind the peaks, and Sarah wrapped the broken music box in her shawl and held it the way other women might hold a locket, or a letter, or a memory too precious to set down. Silver Creek was not much to look at when the coach finally rolled to a stop before the Mercantile. A single dusty street ran between 2 rows of clapboard buildings, a livery stable at one end and a whitewashed church at the other, with the mountains rising up behind the town like a wall built by God to keep the rest of the world out. Men in wide-brimmed hats looked up from their business to watch the new arrival step down, brushing road dust from her traveling dress, her dark hair coming loose from its pins after the long journey. "You'll be wanting the boarding house," the driver said, setting her trunk down in the dirt. "Mrs. Culpepper runs it 2 streets over. Decent woman, though she'll talk your ear clean off." Sarah thanked him and paid the fare, and stood for a moment simply breathing the thin mountain air, so different from the humid closeness of Ohio. She had never seen mountains like these before, their granite shoulders already dusted with the season's first snow, though it was barely October. Something in her chest loosened slightly, some tight fist of fear she had carried since Cleveland, and for the first time in weeks she allowed herself to believe that Cyrus Bellamy did not know where she had gone. She found Mrs. Culpepper's boarding house without much trouble, a 2-story building with faded blue shutters and a porch that sagged at one corner. The proprietress herself turned out to be a stout woman of perhaps 50 with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and she looked Sarah over from bonnet to boots before nodding as though satisfied by whatever calculation she had performed. "You'll want the room at the end of the hall," Mrs. Culpepper said. "Quietest one, though nothing in this town is ever quiet enough when the men come down from the mines on payday. You traveling alone, dear?" "I am. No husband, no family waiting." Sarah hesitated only a fraction of a second. "No, just myself." Mrs. Culpepper's expression softened slightly, as though she recognized something in the younger woman's careful phrasing, some old grief or trouble she had no wish to press upon. "Well, there's honest work to be had if you're willing. Silas Woodrow at the Mercantile needs a woman who can keep his ledger straight and mind the counter, seeing as his eyes aren't what they used to be. Pays fair, and it's respectable work." That night, alone in the small room with its narrow bed and single window looking out toward the dark shoulders of the mountains, Sarah unwrapped the music box from her shawl and set it upon the washstand. She turned the little brass key, though she already knew what would happen, and listened to the broken, halting clatter of gears that no longer understood their purpose. Tears came then, quiet and unbidden, not only for the box but for her mother, for the life she had left behind, for the uncertainty of everything ahead of her. She did not cry for Cyrus Bellamy. She had used up all her tears for him back in Ohio, in the weeks after he had first raised his hand to her, and she had understood, with a clarity that still made her shudder, exactly what kind of life awaited her if she stayed. The following morning she walked to the mercantile and found employment with Silas Woodrow just as Mrs. Culpepper had promised, and it was there, 3 days later, that she first saw Henry Thatcher. He came through the door with a gust of cold mountain air behind him, and Sarah's first impression was of sheer size. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway entirely, and forearms visible beneath rolled shirt sleeves that spoke of years spent swinging an axe and hauling traps through mountain country. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated for town, curling slightly at his collar, and a beard covered a jaw that looked as though it had been carved from the same granite as the peaks surrounding Silver Creek. He wore buckskin trousers and a wool coat gone soft with wear, and when he moved through the narrow aisles of the mercantile he did so carefully, as a large man learns to do in small spaces, mindful of what his body might knock over. "Afternoon, Silas," he said, his voice low and rough as though unused to much conversation. "Need shot for the rifle, and whatever coffee you've got that isn't going to taste like creek water." Silas Woodrow, standing near the back counting stock, called out without looking up, "Sarah here can help you find what you need. Sarah, this is Henry Thatcher. He traps and hunts up in the high country, brings in the best pelts this side of Denver when he bothers to come down at all." Henry Thatcher turned, and Sarah found herself looking up into eyes the color of strong tea, startled by how gentle they seemed set against such an imposing frame. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, Mr. Thatcher." Sarah came around the counter, smoothing her skirt, aware suddenly of how her heart had picked up its pace for no reason she could name. "The shot is in the back corner, and we have coffee just arrived from Denver last week. Fresh enough, I should think." He followed her through the aisles, and she was conscious the entire time of the sheer physical presence of him, the way he seemed to occupy more space than seemed natural for a single man, and yet there was nothing threatening in it. If anything, he seemed to be making himself smaller, apologizing with his posture for every barrel he might brush against. "You're new to Silver Creek," he said, not quite a question. "Arrived 4 days ago. Long way to come." "Yes." She did not elaborate and he did not press, and something in his easy acceptance of her silence made her look at him again, more carefully this time. There was a scar along his left temple, mostly hidden by his hair, and calluses on his hands thick enough that she noticed them even from a distance. "Well," he said, gathering up the coffee and shot she had pointed him toward, "Silver Creek could use more decent folk. Winters get long up here." Man forgets what conversation sounds like. "You live alone, then?" "Cabin up past Elkhorn Ridge, about 6 miles from here. Just me and the mountain." He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way another man might mention the weather. "Suits me well enough most days." She rang up his purchases and he paid in coin, and as he gathered his goods he paused, looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You have kin in Silver Creek, Miss Fletcher?" "No kin. I came out on my own." Something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of understanding or perhaps sympathy, though he said nothing more on the matter. "Well, should you need anything, the mercantile folk can point you toward my cabin easy enough. Man ought to look out for his neighbors, even the ones he's only just met." He left with a nod, and Sarah stood watching through the window as he mounted a large gray horse tethered outside and rode off toward the mountains, and she was surprised to find herself still thinking of him an hour later, of the gentle way he had spoken despite his size, of eyes that seemed to carry some old sorrow of their own. Winter came early and hard to Silver Creek that year, as it often did in the Colorado high country. By the second week of November the snow had begun in earnest, and Sarah found herself settling into the rhythms of the small town, keeping Silas Woodrow's ledgers, attending Sunday services at the little white church, exchanging pleasantries with Mrs. Culpepper's other boarders over supper. She saw Henry Thatcher perhaps twice more in those early weeks, brief exchanges at the mercantile counter when he came down for supplies, and each time she found herself remembering the particular quality of his voice, the careful gentleness of a large man determined never to seem a threat. It was the third week of November when the trouble came, sudden and violent as mountain weather always seemed to be. Sarah had walked out from the mercantile in the late afternoon to deliver a parcel of dry goods to a family on the far edge of town, the Hendricksons, whose youngest boy had taken ill and whose mother could not leave his bedside. The sky had been merely gray when she set out, but by the time she turned back toward the boarding house the wind had picked up into something fierce, and snow began falling in earnest, thick and blinding, the kind of sudden mountain storm that could kill a person caught unprepared. Within minutes Sarah could no longer see the buildings of Silver Creek at all. The world had narrowed to a churning white nothing, wind screaming down off the peaks with a violence that stole the breath from her lungs. And she understood with a cold clarity that she had wandered off the path in her attempt to find shelter, that she was now lost somewhere in the foothills with darkness coming on and the temperature dropping with terrible speed. She stumbled forward, calling out though she knew no one could hear her over the wind, her skirts soaked through and heavy, her hands growing numb even inside her gloves. She thought of her mother, of the music box still wrapped safely in her trunk back at the boarding house, and she thought, with a strange calm that frightened her more than panic would have, that she might simply lie down in the snow and let the cold take her, and that would be the end of the story that had begun so many years ago in Ohio. It was the gray horse she saw first, a shape darker than the surrounding white, and then the man atop it, wrapped in a heavy fur coat with a scarf pulled up over the lower half of his face. Henry Thatcher had been riding back from checking his trap lines when the storm broke, and some instinct born of years spent reading mountain weather, had sent him along the ridge path above the town rather than his usual direct route home. "Miss Fletcher," his voice cut through the wind like a rifle shot, and he was off his horse and moving toward her before she had fully registered that he was real and not some fevered imagining brought on by the cold. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" "I was lost," she managed, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely form the words. "The storm came on so fast I couldn't see the way back." He did not waste time on further questions. He shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders despite her protests, then lifted her bodily onto his horse before swinging up behind her, one massive arm circling her waist to keep her steady. "My cabin's closer than the town in this weather," he said against her ear, his breath warm despite the howling cold around them. "We'll never make Silver Creek before dark, not in this. Hold on tight, Miss Fletcher. Rusty knows this path better than I do." She had no strength left to argue, and truthfully no wish to. She leaned back against the solid wall of his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat even through the layers of clothing between them, and let him guide the horse through the blinding snow toward whatever shelter awaited them. The cabin, when they finally reached it perhaps 20 minutes later though it felt like hours, was small but sturdy, built of thick pine logs with a stone chimney, already sending up a thin curl of smoke from the banked fire inside. Henry helped her down from the horse with easy strength, practically carrying her the last few steps to the door, and once inside he set about building up the fire with quick, practiced movements while she stood shivering near the entrance, still wrapped in his enormous coat. "There's a change of clothes in the trunk there," he said, not looking at her, his voice carefully neutral. "Belonged to my sister before she passed. Should fit you well enough and better than sitting in wet skirts while you catch your death." Sarah's fingers were too numb to manage the buttons at first, and it was several minutes before she had changed into the offered clothing, a simple wool dress that smelled faintly of cedar from long storage. When she emerged from behind the blanket he had hung as a makeshift screen, she found him crouched before the now roaring fire, feeding it another split log, his broad back to her, giving her whatever privacy the small cabin could afford. "Your sister," Sarah said softly. "I'm sorry for your loss." Long time ago now. He rose, turning to face her, and something in his expression suggested old grief carefully contained. "Consumption took her, back in '69, before we ever came west. She was the only family I had left by then. Our parents died when we were young, and it was just the two of us for a good while. He gestured toward the small table near the hearth. You should sit. I'll heat some broth. You've had a fright, and cold like that takes more out of a body than folks realize. Sarah sat, watching him move about the small cabin with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice living alone, and she found herself studying the space itself. It was simply furnished but not without care. Shelves lined with books that surprised her, a narrow bed against one wall, traps and tools hung neatly along another, and above the mantel, incongruous in its delicacy, a small carved wooden bird that seemed entirely too fine a thing for a mountain man's cabin. "You made that?" she asked, nodding toward the bird. He glanced up, following her gaze, and something like embarrassment crossed his weathered features. Whittling. Something to do with the hands during the long winters. Man goes half mad up here alone if he doesn't find some way to occupy himself. He set a pot over the fire. You have something similar, perhaps. Every person carries some small thing that matters more than it should. Sarah's hand went unconsciously to where her trunk would have been, back at the boarding house, and she thought of the music box waiting there, broken and silent. I do, actually. A music box. It belonged to my mother. She paused, surprised at how easily the words came, how safe she felt admitting such a thing to this quiet giant of a man. It broke on the journey out here. I haven't had the heart to throw it away, though I don't suppose there's anyone in Silver Creek who could fix it properly. Henry Thatcher's dark eyes met hers across the small cabin, something thoughtful passing behind them. I might surprise you there, Miss Fletcher. I've fixed harder things than music boxes in my time. Traps, rifle mechanisms, once a pocket watch for a fellow trapper that hadn't worked since the war. Gears are gears, whatever shape they come in. Given time and patience, most anything broken can be made to work again. You would do that for a stranger. You're not so much a stranger as you might think, he said, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. Silver Creek's a small place, Miss Fletcher. Word travels, even up to a cabin as far out as mine. I know you came west with no family waiting, no husband, nothing behind you but whatever you were running from. I don't ask what that was, and I won't pretend I need to know. But a person who's lost as much as that carries their treasures close. I understand that well enough myself. The broth, when it was ready, tasted better than anything Sarah could remember eating in weeks, rich with venison and wild onion, and she found herself relaxing by degrees as the storm continued to howl outside the sturdy walls. Henry Thatcher spoke little as they ate, but what he did say revealed a man of surprising depth. He had come west after his sister's death, unable to bear the memories that clung to their old home in Missouri, and had spent nearly 8 years now in the mountains above Silver Creek, trapping in winter and doing occasional work for the mining operations in summer. He read, she learned, whatever books he could acquire on his infrequent trips to Denver, and he spoke of the mountains themselves with a reverence that suggested they had become to him something like family, something like faith. It's a hard life, he admitted, when she asked if he ever grew lonely. Winters especially. But there's a piece to it too, a kind of honesty. The mountain doesn't lie to you, doesn't pretend to be something it's not. Man could do worse than to learn that kind of truth. And you never thought of leaving, going somewhere with more people, more comfort. He considered the question seriously, as though she had asked something important rather than merely making conversation. I thought of it time to time, but I never found a reason good enough to pull me away from this place. Not yet, anyway. His eyes held hers a moment longer than necessary, and Sarah felt warmth rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. The storm raged through the night, and Henry insisted she take the narrow bed while he settled into a chair near the fire, wrapped in a spare blanket, refusing her protests with a firmness that brooked no argument. I've slept in worse conditions than a chair by a warm fire, Miss Fletcher. You'll take the bed, and that's the end of it. A gentleman doesn't do otherwise. She lay awake for some time, listening to the wind outside and the steady breathing of the man across the room, and found herself thinking, with a kind of wonder that surprised her, that she had not felt this safe in longer than she could remember. By morning, the storm had blown itself out, leaving the world outside blanketed in nearly 2 feet of fresh snow, brilliant and blinding under a clear winter sun. Henry insisted on escorting her back to Silver Creek himself, and the ride down the mountain was quiet but companionable, both of them aware of something having shifted between them in the close quarters of the cabin, though neither yet had words for what that something might be. "I'll be down again in a few days," he said, when they reached the edge of town and he helped her down from the horse before Mrs. Culpepper's boarding house. "If you'll bring me that music box, Miss Fletcher, I'll see what can be done for it. No promises, mind. Some mechanisms are more stubborn than others, but I'd like to try if you'll let me." "I would like that very much, Mr. Thatcher." She hesitated, then added, "Sarah, you may call me Sarah if you like." Something warmed in his dark eyes. "Sarah, then, and you'll call me Henry." He tipped his hat and rode off toward the mountains, and Sarah stood watching him go for longer than was strictly necessary, aware that Mrs. Culpepper was watching from the porch with an expression of frank curiosity, and not particularly caring what conclusions the older woman might draw from the sight. 3 days later, true to his word, Henry Thatcher rode into Silver Creek and found Sarah at the mercantile counter. She had brought the music box wrapped carefully in cloth, and she handed it to him with something like reluctance, as though giving up a piece of herself into his keeping. "It was my mother's," she explained again, watching his large hands turn the box over with surprising gentleness. "She used to play it for me when I was small, before she took ill. It's the only thing of hers I managed to bring with me." Henry opened the lid carefully, examining the bent cylinder and damaged comb with the focused attention of a man who understood mechanisms, who saw not just broken metal but a puzzle waiting to be solved. "This'll take some doing," he said finally. "Cylinders bent in 3 places, and 2 of the comb's teeth have snapped clean off. I'll need to fashion new ones, which means finding steel thin enough to work but strong enough to hold a note. Might take some weeks, Sarah. I won't rush this kind of work and risk ruining it further." "Take whatever time you need," she said. "I've waited this long. A few more weeks won't break my heart, so long as it comes back singing in the end." He smiled then, the first true smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his weathered features entirely, softening the granite jaw and crinkling the corners of his tea-colored eyes. "I'll do right by it, Sarah. You have my word." That winter became, without either of them quite planning it, a season of courtship conducted in small increments. Henry rode down from his cabin every week or 10 days, ostensibly for supplies, but always finding reason to visit the mercantile when Sarah was working, always bringing some small report on the music box's progress. He had found steel thin enough for the comb teeth, he told her one week, salvaged from an old clock spring he'd traded a trapper for. Another visit brought news that he had straightened 2 of the 3 bends in the cylinder using tools so fine she could barely see them in his enormous hands, a delicate contradiction that fascinated her more each time she witnessed it. "How does a man your size manage such careful work?" she asked him one January afternoon, watching him demonstrate with a set of tiny files how he intended to shape the new comb teeth. "Patience," he said simply, "and practice. Trapping teaches a man patience if nothing else does. You set a trap and then you wait, sometimes days, for the right moment. Fixing a broken thing isn't so different. You can't force it. You have to understand what it wants to become again, and then help it get there, slow and steady." She found herself thinking often of that philosophy, applying it perhaps to more than just the music box. She herself felt broken in ways she had not fully admitted even to herself, bent out of shape by Cyrus Bellamy's cruelty and her own fear, and something about watching Henry Thatcher's patient, careful work on her mother's treasure made her believe, for the first time in years, that broken things truly could be mended, given enough time and the right hands. Their conversations deepened as the winter wore on. Henry learned, in careful pieces offered when she felt ready to share them, the truth of what had driven Sarah west, A courtship in Ohio that had begun sweetly enough but curdled into possession and violence. A man named Cyrus Bellamy who had struck her more than once and threatened worse when she spoke of leaving. A desperate flight in the night with only what she could carry, and the address of a fictional aunt to give her cover story credibility. He said he would find me, she admitted one evening in March, when the worst of winter had begun to loosen its grip, and the visits between them had become something both anticipated and treasured. They sat together near the mercantile stove, Silas Woodrow having tactfully absented himself to check inventory in the back room. He said no matter where I ran, he would find me eventually, and I would regret ever having left. Henry's jaw tightened, something dangerous flickering behind his usually gentle eyes. He'll not find you here, Sarah, not while I've breath in my body to prevent it. You hardly know me, Henry. Why would you make such a promise? He was quiet a long moment, his large hands, so capable of delicate work, resting still upon the counter between them. I know enough, he said finally. I know you've got more courage than most folks twice your size, coming west alone with nothing but $42 in your mother's broken music box. He paused, seeing her surprise. Mrs. Culpepper mentioned the money, sewing it into your hem like that. Small towns, Sarah. Little stays secret for long. His expression softened. I know you've faced down a storm without complaint, and slept easy in a stranger's cabin trusting he meant you no harm. And I know that every week I ride down this mountain, it's become less about supplies and more about seeing your face again. That's enough knowing for me to make a promise like that. Sarah's breath caught, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the air between them charged with something neither had yet given proper name. Henry Thatcher, she said finally softly, I believe you may be courting me. I believe I may be, he agreed, and the smile that spread across his weathered face held nothing of hesitation. Would that trouble you, Sarah Fletcher? No, she said, and found she meant it entirely. No, I don't believe it would trouble me at all. Spring came to Silver Creek in a rush of melting snow and mud-choked streets, wildflowers pushing up through the thawing earth along the foothills, and with it came a formal courtship that the entire town seemed to watch with undisguised interest. Henry took to escorting Sarah to Sunday services, his enormous frame looking almost comical squeezed into the small church pew beside her slighter one, though no one who saw the tenderness in his eyes when he looked at her found anything comical in it at all. They walked together after services when weather permitted, along the creek that gave the town its name, talking of everything and nothing, of books they had read and places they hoped someday to see, of the small dreams that had survived whatever hardships had brought each of them to this remote mountain town. It was during one such walk in late April that Henry finally brought the music box back to her, fully repaired. I finished it 3 days ago, he admitted, producing it from beneath his coat where he had kept it wrapped and hidden. I wanted to be certain it worked properly before I gave it back to you. Didn't want to disappoint you if something still needed adjustment. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the box, running her fingers over the familiar mahogany case, now polished to a warm shine that suggested careful cleaning alongside the mechanical repairs. Henry, I don't know how to thank you properly. This has meant more to me than I think I've managed to express. You don't need to thank me at all. Turn the key, Sarah. See if an old mountain man managed to do right by your mother's memory. She turned the small brass key with fingers that shook, and lifted the lid, and for a moment there was silence, and her heart clenched with fear that somehow the repair had failed, that this precious thing would remain broken despite all his careful work. Then the cylinder began to turn, smooth and steady, and the comb's teeth, some original and some fashioned new by Henry's patient hands, began to pluck out the familiar melody of her mother's favorite waltz, clear and sweet and whole in a way Sarah had not heard in over a decade. Tears sprang immediately to her eyes, and she looked up at Henry Thatcher standing before her with the mountains rising green and glorious behind him, and understood in that moment with a certainty that settled deep into her bones that she loved this gentle giant of a man completely. It sings, she whispered, half laughing and half weeping at once. Henry, it truly sings again. I told you I'd do right by it, he said, his own eyes suspiciously bright. And when she stepped forward and embraced him, wrapping her arms as far as they would reach around his broad chest, he held her carefully, as though she too were something precious and easily broken, and pressed a kiss to the top of her dark hair. I love you, she said into the wool of his coat, muffled but unmistakable. I don't know when it happened exactly, but I love you, Henry Thatcher, and I don't care who in this town knows it. He pulled back just enough to look down into her face, his large hands framing her cheeks with a tenderness that belied their strength and calluses. I loved you the moment I found you lost in that storm and realized I would have ridden through 100 more just like it to reach you in time. I love you, Sarah Fletcher, and if you'll have me, I'd like nothing more in this world than to make you my wife. The music box continued to play between them, the small mechanism finally free of the imperfections that had silenced it for so long, and Sarah Fletcher, standing in the spring sunshine with the mountains all around and the melody of her mother's memory filling the air, said yes to Henry Thatcher with her whole heart. Word of their engagement spread through Silver Creek with the speed such news always traveled in small towns. And if there were those who whispered about the mismatch between the gentle-mannered mountain man and the mysterious young woman with no family to speak for her, such whispers were far outnumbered by genuine happiness for the couple. Mrs. Culpepper wept openly when Sarah told her the news, declaring she had known from the very first evening that something would come of the way Henry Thatcher had looked at her new boarder. Silas Woodrow offered to close the mercantile for a full day so the whole town could attend the wedding, an offer he made good on when the date was finally set for the second Saturday in June. But the story of Sarah Fletcher and Henry Thatcher was not yet finished with its trials, and the peace of that spring engagement would soon be tested by a shadow from Sarah's past that neither of them had quite believed would follow her so far. It happened on a Tuesday in late May, less than 3 weeks before the planned wedding, when a stranger rode into Silver Creek asking questions at the livery stable and the saloon about a woman matching Sarah's description who might have passed through in recent months. The stranger was a hard-faced man named Cyrus Bellamy, and he had spent the better part of 6 months and no small amount of money tracking Sarah's trail west from Ohio, driven by a possessive rage that had only deepened with each month she remained beyond his reach. Word reached Sarah through Mrs. Culpepper, who had heard the description from a neighbor and recognized immediately who the stranger must be seeking. Sarah's face went pale as milk when she heard the news, her hands beginning to shake so violently that she nearly dropped the teacup she had been holding. "He's found me," she whispered. "After all this time, all this distance, he's actually found me." "Now don't you fret, dear," Mrs. Culpepper said firmly, though worry creased her own weathered features. "This is Silver Creek, not Ohio. You've got friends here now, and that Thatcher fellow who'd walk through fire for you if it came to that. This Bellamy man can ask all the questions he likes, but he can't force you to go anywhere you don't wish to." But Sarah knew Cyrus Bellamy in ways Mrs. Culpepper could not understand, knew the particular flavor of his cruelty, and the lengths to which his wounded pride might drive him. She sent word immediately to Henry's cabin by way of a boy from town who knew the mountain paths, and by nightfall Henry Thatcher had ridden down from Elkhorn Ridge with an expression on his face that Sarah had never before seen there, something hard and dangerous beneath the usual gentleness. "Where is he now?" Henry asked, standing in the boarding-house parlor with his rifle still slung across his back, having come directly from the mountain without pausing even to eat. Silas said he took a room at the saloon, asking around about a woman named Sarah who might have come through recently. "He described me exactly, Henry. There's no mistaking who he's looking for." "He'll not touch you," Henry said, and the quiet certainty in his voice was more frightening than any shout might have been. "I don't care what claim he thinks he has on you, Sarah. That man will not lay a hand on you again while I draw breath. Henry, please, I don't want violence. I've seen enough of what that man is capable of, and I couldn't bear it if something happened to you on my account." He took her hands in his his large fingers surprisingly gentle despite the tension evident in every line of his powerful frame. "I don't intend violence unless he forces the matter, Sarah. But I will not stand aside and let him frighten you, or worse, try to take you from this town against your will. You are not his property, whatever he may believe. You are a free woman, and soon you will be my wife, and I will protect what is mine with everything I have." The confrontation, when it came the following morning, took place on the main street of Silver Creek in full view of half the town's population, drawn by the tension that had been building since word of the stranger's questions had spread overnight. Cyrus Bellamy emerged from the saloon looking travel-worn but no less arrogant than the man Sarah remembered, his fine Eastern clothing incongruous against the rough mountain backdrop. And when he caught sight of Sarah, standing near the mercantile with Henry Thatcher at her side, his face twisted into an expression of triumph mixed with fury. "There you are," he called out, striding toward them with a confidence that suggested he had never once doubted his ability to reclaim what he considered rightfully his. 6 months, Sarah, 6 months and a fortune spent tracking you halfway across this God-forsaken country. You'll come home now, and we'll speak no more of this foolishness." "I have no home in Ohio, Cyrus," Sarah said, and though her voice trembled slightly, she did not step back, did not allow herself to shrink from him as she once might have. "I have a home here now, and a life you have no part of." Cyrus's eyes flicked to Henry, taking in his size and evident protectiveness with a sneer that failed to fully mask an undercurrent of uncertainty. "And who might this be? Some rough mountain trash you've taken up within your foolishness. Sarah, you belong to me. We were as good as engaged before you ran off like a frightened child." "I never agreed to marry you," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You made that decision for me, same as you made the decision to raise your hand against me when I dared question your wishes. I am not your property, Cyrus Bellamy, and I never was." The crowd that had gathered along the street murmured at this, several of the men present exchanging dark looks at the implication of violence against a woman, a thing not tolerated even in the rough justice of frontier towns. Cyrus, sensing the shift in public sentiment, changed tactics. "Whatever occurred between us was a private matter, hardly the business of strangers," he said, attempting a tone of reasonable authority. "Sarah, be sensible. Come with me now, and we'll discuss this like civilized people, away from this audience." "She's not going anywhere with you," Henry said, speaking for the first time, and though his voice remained level, the sheer size of him seemed to grow more imposing with every word. "Miss Fletcher has made her wishes clear, Mr. Bellamy. I suggest you respect them and be on your way back to Ohio." "This is none of your concern, mountain man." Cyrus's confidence wavered slightly as he took in Henry's full measure, but pride would not let him back down entirely. "Sarah is my intended, whatever fiction she's constructed for herself out here." "Sarah Fletcher is my intended," Henry corrected, his voice carrying clearly down the length of the street. "We are to be married in less than 3 weeks, with the blessing of this entire town. You have no claim here and no welcome either." Cyrus's face flushed dark with anger, and for a moment Sarah feared he might attempt violence right there in the street, might reach for the pistol she could see holstered at his hip. But whatever calculation passed behind his eyes, whether cowardice or a final flicker of reason, he did not draw the weapon. "You'll regret this, Sarah," he spat instead, backing toward his horse tethered outside the saloon. "Out here in the wilderness with no family, no proper society. You'll come crawling back to Ohio soon enough, and I won't be so forgiving then." "I would rather live my whole life in this wilderness than spend one more day under your roof," Sarah replied, and there was such conviction in her voice that several onlookers murmured approval. "Go home, Cyrus. There is nothing for you here." He mounted his horse with as much dignity as he could muster under the circumstances, casting one final glare toward Henry Thatcher before spurring his horse toward the road leading east, back toward Ohio and whatever life he had left behind there. The crowd watched him go in silence, and only after he had disappeared around the bend did the tension in the street finally begin to ease. Sarah found herself trembling once the immediate crisis had passed, the accumulated fear of months finally releasing itself, now that the confrontation she had dreaded was actually behind her. Henry gathered her against his broad chest without hesitation, uncaring of the audience still watching from doorways and windows along the street. "He won't come back," Henry murmured against her hair. "A man like that, all bluster and cruelty when he thinks he holds power over someone weaker. Once he understood he'd lost that power, there was nothing left for him to fight for. How can you be certain? I've hunted enough animals to know the difference between a predator with true courage and one that only preys on the helpless. Cyrus Bellamy is the second kind, Sarah. He'll return to Ohio and find some other way to salve his wounded pride, but he'll not trouble you again. I'd stake my life on it." His confidence proved well-founded. No further word came from Cyrus Bellamy in the weeks that followed, and as June approached and preparations for the wedding intensified, the shadow of Sarah's past finally began to lift entirely, leaving room for nothing but anticipation of the future she and Henry would build together. The wedding itself took place on a bright Saturday morning in mid-June, in the small white church at the edge of Silver Creek, with nearly the entire town in attendance, despite the demands of ranch work and mining schedules that might otherwise have kept many away. Sarah wore a dress of pale blue that Mrs. Culpepper had helped her sew over the preceding weeks, simple but elegant, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered that very morning from the meadows below Elkhorn Ridge. Henry Thatcher stood at the front of the church looking almost unrecognizable in a proper suit borrowed from Silas Woodrow, his long hair combed back, and his beard neatly trimmed for the occasion, though nothing could disguise the powerful build beneath the formal clothing. When Sarah came down the short aisle on the arm of Silas Woodrow, who had offered to give her away in the absence of any actual family, Henry's expression held such open wonder and adoration that several of the women present were moved to tears before the ceremony had even properly begun. The preacher, a circuit rider named Reverend Aldous Finch, who happened to be passing through Silver Creek that particular week, spoke of love that endured hardship, of two broken souls finding wholeness together. And though he could not have known the specific details of Sarah's music box or the long winter of patient repair that had brought these two people together, his words seemed to speak directly to the heart of their particular story. When at last the vows were exchanged, and Henry Thatcher was permitted to kiss his new bride, the small church erupted in applause and cheerful shouting that would have seemed entirely out of place in a more formal Eastern ceremony, but felt exactly right for the rough warmth of frontier Silver Creek. The celebration that followed took place outdoors behind the mercantile, with tables laden with food contributed by nearly every family in town, fiddle music provided by a miner known for his skill with the instrument, and dancing that continued well into the evening, as the long June daylight finally faded into a sky brilliant with stars unobscured by any city's competing lights. Sarah danced with her new husband beneath that vast mountain sky, feeling for the first time in years that she had truly found the place where she belonged, the person with whom her future finally made sense. It was during a quiet moment away from the main celebration, when Henry had led her to a small rise overlooking the town where they could hear the music but had privacy enough for conversation, that Sarah produced the music box from where she had kept it hidden, wrapped in a cloth, throughout the day's festivities. "I wanted this moment to have music of its own," she said, opening the lid and letting the familiar waltz spill out into the mountain air, mingling strangely but beautifully with the fiddle tunes still audible from the celebration below. "This song has meant so much to me, Henry. My mother's memory, carried all this way, broken and then made whole again by your hands. I can think of no better music for the first dance of our marriage." Henry took her in his arms there on the hillside, his large frame moving with surprising grace despite his size, and they danced together to the delicate mechanical melody of the music box, while the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. "I have something for you as well," he said, when the melody finally wound down and the box fell silent once more. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small wooden carving, similar in style to the bird she had seen above his cabin's mantel on that first snowy night together. But this one shaped like two birds nested together, wings entwined. "I carved this over the winter, working on it in the evenings after I'd finished with your mother's music box," he explained, placing it carefully in her palm. "I wanted you to have something of my own making too, something to remind you that whatever broken pieces either of us carried before we found each other, we can build something whole together now." Sarah closed her fingers around the small carving, feeling the smooth wood warm from his pocket, and looked up into the face of the man she had married that very day, this gentle giant who had rebuilt her mother's music box gear by patient gear until it sang again, who had ridden through a blinding storm to save her life, who had stood unflinching against the man who had once made her fear for her safety. "I love you, Henry Thatcher," she said simply, "more than I have words to properly express." "I love you too, Sarah Thatcher," he replied, testing her new name with evident satisfaction. "For all the years we have ahead of us, and every winter storm and summer sunset in between." They returned to the celebration hand in hand, and the music box came to rest that night, and for many nights after, on the mantel of Henry's cabin, no longer the cabin of a solitary mountain man, but the shared home of a married couple beginning their life together in the shadow of Elkhorn Ridge. The years that followed brought their own challenges, as frontier life invariably did, but Sarah and Henry Thatcher faced them together with the same patient partnership that had characterized their courtship. Henry expanded his trapping operation gradually, eventually adding a small herd of cattle that grazed the meadows below the cabin, while Sarah continued for a time to help Silas Woodrow with his ledgers before the growing demands of their own homestead required her full attention. Their first child, a son they named William after Henry's father, arrived in the spring of 1879, less than a year after their wedding. Henry proved as gentle and capable with the infant as he had been with the delicate mechanisms of the music box, and Sarah often found herself smiling at the sight of her enormous husband cradling their tiny son with the same careful precision he had once applied to bent cylinder pins and broken comb teeth. A daughter, Margaret, followed 2 years later, named for Sarah's own mother, whose memory the music box had preserved through all the trials of the journey west. By the time their third child arrived, a second son they called Thomas, the cabin on Elkhorn Ridge had grown into a proper homestead, expanded with additional rooms Henry had built himself over successive summers, though he insisted on keeping the original cabin structure intact as the heart of their growing home, the place where he had first brought Sarah in from the storm, and where the music box had first sung again after its long silence. The town of Silver Creek grew alongside their family as mining operations expanded and more settlers arrived drawn by rumors of silver in the surrounding hills. Mrs. Culpepper's boarding house expanded into a proper hotel by the mid-1880s, and Silas Woodrow's mercantile grew large enough to require additional help, work that occasionally fell to a teenage William Thatcher during summers when his father could spare him from ranch duties. Sarah never heard from Cyrus Bellamy again after that confrontation on the streets of Silver Creek, though she learned some years later, through a letter from a cousin in Ohio with whom she maintained sporadic correspondence, that he had eventually married a woman of his own social standing back east and seemed to have settled into a life that, while perhaps not happy, at least kept him far from Colorado and any further thoughts of pursuing the woman who had once escaped his cruelty. The music box remained always in a place of honor in the Thatcher home, moved eventually to a small table in the parlor where Sarah could see it whenever she sat with her mending or her correspondence, but brought out regularly for special occasions and simple evenings when the family gathered near the fire. Each of the Thatcher children grew up knowing the story of how their mother had arrived in Silver Creek with a broken treasure, and how their father had spent a long winter patiently coaxing it back to life, gear by careful gear, until it sang once more with the melody that had first drawn them together. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, in June of 1888, Henry surprised Sarah with a gift he had been secretly working on for months in the small workshop he had built onto the side of their expanded home. It was a second music box, larger than her mother's original, carved from cherry wood he had traded for on one of his increasingly rare trips to Denver, its mechanism entirely of his own construction rather than repair, built from scratch using skills he had refined over the decade since first attempting to fix her mother's treasure. "I wanted to give you something that was entirely new," he explained, presenting the box to her on their anniversary evening, the children already settled for the night and the two of them alone by the fire much as they had been on that first snowy evening so many years before. "Something to represent not just what we saved from your past, but everything we've built together since." Sarah opened the lid with trembling fingers and found, to her astonishment and delight, that the melody Henry had crafted into this new mechanism was an original composition, one he must have worked out with the same patient precision he applied to every mechanical problem, incorporating elements of her mother's waltz, but building into something new and entirely their own. A melody that seemed to capture the particular joy and hard-won piece of the life they had made together in the mountains above Silver Creek. "Henry," she whispered, tears bright in her eyes as the new melody filled their parlor, "this is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." "You gave me a reason to become a better man than I might otherwise have been," he replied, settling beside her on the small sofa and wrapping one strong arm around her shoulders as they listened together to the music he had created. "A broken music box brought you into my life, Sarah, but it was you yourself, your courage and your heart, that taught this old mountain man what it truly meant to love someone. I've spent 10 years trying to be worthy of that gift, and I intend to spend however many years remain to us continuing that effort." "You have always been worthy of it," Sarah said, leaning into his embrace as the music finally wound down to its close. "From that very first night in your cabin, when you gave up your own bed without a second thought and slept in a chair rather than see me uncomfortable, I knew there was something rare and good in you, Henry Thatcher. Everything since has only confirmed what I sensed that very first evening." Their family continued to grow and flourish through the remaining years of the century, William eventually taking over much of the ranching operation as Henry's joints, worn by decades of mountain living, began to protest the harder physical demands of trapping and construction work. Margaret grew into a young woman known throughout the region for her skill with a needle, having inherited her mother's careful hands and patient temperament, while young Thomas developed an unexpected talent for mechanical work that echoed his father's own gift, eventually apprenticing with a clockmaker in Denver before returning to Silver Creek to open his own small shop specializing in the repair of watches, clocks, and on more than one occasion, other music boxes brought to him by settlers who had heard the story of his father's famous repair work. Sarah Fletcher Thatcher lived to see grandchildren gather around that same original music box, now well over 40 years old, and still playing her mother's waltz as clearly as it had on that spring afternoon when Henry first returned it to her, fully mended. She and Henry remained partners in every sense through all the decades of their marriage, weathering the hardships that frontier life inevitably brought, celebrating the joys of a family built on foundations of patience, respect, and a love that had begun with a broken treasure and a mountain man's willingness to spend a whole winter, gear by careful gear, making something precious sing again. On quiet evenings in their later years, when the children had grown and established homes of their own throughout the expanding town of Silver Creek, Henry and Sarah would often sit together on the porch of the home they had built, watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar shades of gold and rose. And Sarah would sometimes wind the old music box one more time, letting its melody drift out into the evening air as it had on so many occasions across the decades of their shared life. "Do you ever think about that first storm?" she asked him once, when they had both grown gray but remained as devoted to each other as they had been in the earliest days of their courtship. How different everything might have been if you hadn't happened to ride that particular path. Henry considered the question with the same thoughtful seriousness he had always brought to matters that mattered to her. "I think the mountain knew you needed finding," he said finally. "Same as I think that music box knew it needed mending, and knew somehow that I was the one meant to do the mending. Some things in this world happen exactly as they're meant to, Sarah. I've come to believe that more with each passing year we've spent together. And if I hadn't come west at all, if I had stayed in Ohio, afraid to leave, then I expect I'd still be up in that cabin alone, growing old with nothing but my traps and my books for company, never knowing what I was missing." He took her weathered hand in his, still strong despite the years, and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I'm grateful every single day that you found the courage to leave, Sarah. Grateful for whatever storm brought you into my path, and grateful for every year we've had since to build this life together." The music box continued to play its gentle melody as the sun finally disappeared behind the peaks of Elkhorn Ridge, and Sarah Fletcher Thatcher, surrounded by the family and the love she had once feared she would never find, closed her eyes and listened to a song that had traveled with her from Ohio to Colorado, broken and then made whole again, much like her own heart, in the patient and capable hands of the mountain man who had loved her from that very first snowy night, and who would continue loving her, gear by gear and day by day, for all the remaining years of their long and happy life together. Their story became something of a local legend in Silver Creek as the years passed into a new century, told and retold by those who remembered the young woman who had arrived with nothing but a broken treasure, and found in its place an entire life, a family, and a love story that had begun with the simple sound of gears clicking back into their proper places, learning once again how to sing.